Hello and welcome to another sound booth tutorial. I post a new video every weekend and please remember to like, share, subscribe and comment below. Also feel free to visit the Facebook page where I'm a little bit more accessible and post extra content from time to time. Today I discuss mix translation in a home studio. For those of you who don't know, the term mix translation is a general way of describing how well our mixes play back in different environments and on different systems that are less than ideal, such as hi-fi systems, car stereos, kitchen radios, or boom boxes. The problem with checking externally is that it takes us outside of our studio, and by the time we take notes, run back, and make changes, it is mostly a guessing game of what we remember hearing. It is easy to lose objectivity, so the changes, at least for me, really made no desirable difference until I devised a system that worked for me, which removed a lot of that back and forth guesswork. The car test is infamous for this very reason, and I avoided it for as long as I could. You see, the problem with the car is that we listen on 4 speakers that are producing stereo information, 2 at the front and 2 firing from the back seats. The tweeters sit around leg height instead of in line with our ears. We sit out of the sweet spot. Add to that the enclosed cabin, and you've got a recipe for destructive comb filtering. With domestic playback, each system equalizes the sound in its own way, as does the listening environment. Smaller speakers also often struggle to reproduce the entire spectrum and may distort if presented with too much low-end information. Therefore, there is a lot to glean from listening to all these other playback systems and in different environments when it comes to understanding the real-world translation of our mixes. So where do we begin? Firstly, I recommend getting your hands on a basic laptop that can run a copy of your DAW of choice. You also need storage for transferring files between PC and laptop, such as a USB stick or external drive. If the studio PC is your laptop, all the better, you can skip this step. Next, route the headphone out from the portable interface connected to the laptop into your chosen domestic playback device. In my case, I use a beaten up old laptop with an MBox 2 and Pro Tools version 8 LE. Basically, it's a reliable way to play back and process audio in real time. Now start up a new session on the laptop, duplicating the mix out for each additional device, and name each duplicate channel to keep track of what you are listening to. Listening on the first domestic sound system, apply EQ to its channel and address the larger tonality problems that grab your attention first. It is unnecessary to fix every problem, just focus on the overall balance. The goal is to make it sound better overall, not so much to replicate the studio version, but to remove problems first and then enhance other areas that allow the mix to speak in its own way on that particular playback device. So make it sound better, not the same. Take your time, searching for the most critical aspects that need fixing. If the low end overwhelms the mix, start there. Boost and find the exact frequency range that is causing the most issues for you and pull that out. Push the cut way down and then back it off slowly to where you would like to cut it out more, but you can live with it. Then rebalance the output level and bypass the EQ. Play back the original mix and acclimate to that again, then pop the EQ in after about 10 or 15 seconds. Do you agree with the changes? If, for example, when you put the EQ back in, you realize you boosted too much top end, pull the filter back until you cannot stand to remove any more of that boost. Repeat the process, bypass, and acclimatize to the original sound, and then test whether the mix sounds better when you pop the EQ in. Once you're satisfied, move on to another device and repeat the process from scratch. Essentially, by compromising the degree of EQ boosts and cuts, you negate using excessive amounts of EQ and therefore maintain a healthy perspective. This saves a lot of guesswork when you take it back to the studio because If your studio monitors agree with those EQ choices, you then have the option to push those boosts or cuts slightly further without too much trepidation. Generally, I recommend making EQ decisions whilst listening at low levels, as low as possible, because it forces you to fix only the critical problems. And I find that it's easier to determine volume and pitch differences compared to listening loud. Another side effect of when you're listening quietly is that you minimize the coloration from the listening environment. You can turn up to assess the weight of the low frequencies, but even then, my advice is to make those final EQ moves at the lower listening level. If you're uncomfortable with EQ, my suggestion is to use mostly subtractive EQ, but start by boosting frequencies first in the areas you think problems reside, and then sweep until you find something that makes the mix sound worse on that device. From there, refine your Q settings to grab as much or as little of the frequency that you need and no more. Then cut far too much of it out. The mix should then feel like it's missing a chunk of valuable information. So then slowly back off the degree of cut until the mix feels balanced again. Then test out your EQ decisions as I described earlier. Once you bring the mix session back to the studio, play between the various mixes on your main monitors and note the common EQ moves. Though if you've been paying attention, you have a fair idea by now what those commonalities are. At this point, I would collate the common EQ moves to one EQ and then instantiate that across the original mix. We know for a fact that each of these EQ moves contribute to better playback on the domestic systems, so provided that their inclusion on the studio mix helps it sound better, we can make a fairly accurate assumption that they are pointing us in the right direction as far as translation is concerned. As with testing on domestic systems, you want to hear the mix improve, so adjust the degree of any boosts or cuts until the mix feels right to you. Now, we could just leave it there with the EQ across the mix, but I believe it always sounds better addressing the problems directly rather than trying to fix them with bus EQ alone. In the practical example used throughout this video, I found 4 general areas that needed corrections. Filtering out the frequencies above and below the first correction point reveals that 4 different instruments occupy the same space. The bottom of the vocals, the low mids of the bass, the bottom of the acoustic guitar, and a little of the bottom frequencies from the Rhodes part. Since I cut frequencies in this area and it improved playback across the board, the question is now which instrument or instruments do I change? Do I need to adjust instrument levels or channel EQ on each of those instruments or a combination? Is the bass guitar too loud, or do I need to dip out clashing frequencies from the Rhodes, guitar, and voice? How I proceed depends largely on the role of each instrument in the mix, but the idea is to correctly identify the problem instruments and make adjustments at the channel or group processing level. Filtering around the second correction point reveals that the nasally part of the vocal clashes with some of what the Rhodes is doing, but the vocal also appears to contain occasional unpleasant resonant peaks too. In this case, I would treat the vocal with dynamic EQ or focus multiband compression and make a small EQ cut in the same area on the Rhodes part, though it really depends on how it all sounds in context. Moving along to the third correction, a boost between 2,000 to 3,000 cycles. This is right in the thick of the vocal presence range. I remember feeling that I wanted more of the voice in that area, but adding a presence boost to bring out the vocal more also brought out the hi-hat too far and made the snare a bit papery sounding too. Obviously, the vocal itself needs to absorb this EQ boost, and that should fix the problem. If needed, I may also cut some of that area out of the snare and hi-hats. The final EQ move brings out more of the hard pan stereo information, giving the mix a wider feel, as well as enhancing diction on the vocal. The intention was good, but it too brought out ugly aspects such as string squeaks and pick noises from the acoustic guitar, and the piercing top end from the hi-hats and snare drum. There are many ways to tackle this, but I would start with a shelving boost on the vocal and a complementary dip on the hi-hats, snare, and acoustic guitar, and see where that leads me, all while listening in context, of course. If that does not work, then I might duck the snare and hi-hats using the vocal as a sidechain input to their compressor, or apply boosts and cuts on instruments that compete with the vocal. Whatever the method of addressing the balance, I would still ensure that the mix retains that sense of width it gained from the original corrective boost. Remember, you can always refine the mix further by repeating the tests after the first round of instrument corrections. So the goal is not to figure out an overall EQ balance that suits all systems, but instead to use that to identify the instruments that create those imbalances, how and when they create them, and then fix them directly. It sounds more complicated than it perhaps is, but I promise if you put in the time and listen intently, each system will tell you something useful, and they will collectively help your mixes translate. Ultimately, I want the mastering engineer to tell me that they needed very little corrective EQ, because that means I'm making the home studio work for me, not against me. I hope this helps, and I look forward to hearing from you. Leave me a comment below and let me know what worked and what didn't work for you. If it improves your mix even just a tiny amount, then I would personally take that as a win. Until next time, happy mixing.